Hello, it's Friday the 7th of January and this is Scotland at 7 now. I'm in the studio here, I'm Hugh Stewart and I'm in the studio in Glasgow with Brian Liddy. So we'll be discussing the main stories in a few minutes. But first I'll begin with the coronavirus update. As of 2 p.m. today, a total of 4,058,503 people in Scotland have been tested through the NHS Scotland labs and the UK Government regional testing centres since the start of the pandemic. Of these, 3,033,440 have been confirmed negative, 1,025,063 have tested positive. There are 14,486 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test, although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms and not all those with symptoms will be tested. The figures being reported today will include a backlog from before Christmas. There are 15 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 9,905. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 1,323 were in hospital last night, 48 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 a.m. today, 4,388,543 people had received the first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, 4,037,434 had received a second dose, and 3,063,000 have received a third dose, the booster. The latest UK daily figures show 149,744 patients who had tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness. That's an increase of 229 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings and not just hospitals. So Brian, I think we should leave it maybe till next week before we really comment on the figures, because some of these numbers do include figures that were left over, if you like, from the holiday period. So we'll do that next week. And now let's move on to tonight's headlines. Kazakh president gave the order to open fire with lethal force. The second story we'll look at is that.
It's under other order.
Right. Okay. I'll just let's just read up that story, Brian, and then we'll comment on them afterwards. So, the Kazakhstan's president, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, has said that he personally gave the order to security forces and the army to open fire with lethal force against protesters whom he called bandits and terrorists. In an uncompromising address on Today, Tokayev said lethal force without warning would continue to be used against violent demonstrators, and also blamed so-called free media outlets for helping fan unrest. Authorities have said dozens of protesters were killed in the clashes, as well as 18 people from police and security forces. The figures may rise. More than 3,000 people have been detained, according to Interior Ministry figures. Protests were sparked this week by a sudden rise in fuel prices combined with long simmering frustrations over the political and economic situation in the country. Tokayev claimed that all demands made in a peaceful form have been heard, but appeared to dismiss a large proportion of protesters as criminals, saying that 20,000 bandits were involved in the unrest in Almaty, Kazakhstan's largest city and the centre of recent unrest. Tokayev insisted that the protests are bandits and terrorists who should be destroyed. Earlier today, government figures insisted that security forces had the situation under control across the country, including in Almaty. However, there were reports of fresh gunfire in the city. Tokayev thanked the peacekeeping forces sent by Russia and other nations from the Collective Security Treaty Organization, that's a CSTO, but said that they had not taken any part in the fighting. The Russian Defense Ministry said Russian peacekeepers were guarding Almaty Airport on Friday and other key infrastructure sites. The force totals about 2,500 personnel, the regional alliance has said. Western countries are already on high alert over the potential of a Russian attack on Ukraine, and only seem able to look on with unease at the situation in Kazakhstan. Over 344,000 households across Scotland have been directly impacted by the cut to universal credit impacted by Boris Johnson's government, according to new statistics. Analysis from the House of Commons Library has revealed that, as of August 2021, 344,022 households across Scotland saw their income slashed by £1,040 per year, at the same time as the country was gripped by a global pandemic and the Brexit-fuelled cost of living crisis. Despite repeated warnings from every quarter of civil society about the disastrous consequences, Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak ploughed ahead with their decision to end the Lifeline uplift. In contrast, the SNP Scottish Government this year introduced a game-changing Scottish child payment and has committed to doubling it to £20 per week from April, a move that has been endorsed by a number of key stakeholders. Commenting, the SNP's Work and Pension spokesperson David Linden MP said, "The latest analysis from the House of Commons Library is damning and highlights what the SNP warned would happen if the UK government slashed universal credit. As a result of Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak's callous cut, over 340,000 households across Scotland will be facing a harsh and difficult 2022. Boris Johnson's Tory government is driven by rampant corruption and cronyism, the SNP has said today, after damning revelations that the Downing Street official referred a festival idea from the very same Tory donor who was funding Johnson's lavish flat revamp. In an exchange of texts between Boris Johnson and Tory donor Lord Brownlow, Johnson said that he was on the Great Exhibition plan, in the same message as asking for cash for his taxpayer-funded flat. Just 2 months later, Lord Brownlow secured a meeting with Culture Secretary Oliver Dowden. The Prime Minister's deputy spokesman said, as is quite usual when any suggestions such as this are put forward, it's right that it's passed on to the relevant department to take forward. As you're aware, Oliver Dowden met with Lord Brownlow at the Albert Hall on the joint proposal. Commenting, the SNP's Deputy Westminster leader Kirsten Oswald MP said, "Boris Johnson is stumbling from one scandal to the next. These damning revelations once again show that his government is driven by rampant corruption and cronyism. The Prime Minister may believe he has dodged a bullet over the Lord Geit's inquiry, but these text messages shine a light on the cash for access scandal at the heart of Downing Street." As well as the cash for festivals messages, The Guardian has published allegations that Tory peer Michelle Mone and her husband had a financial interest in a company she had recommended to the Cabinet Office for a PPE supply contract. The Court of Appeal may be asked to look into the not guilty verdict for the 4 Black Lives Matter protesters who destroyed the Colston statue in Bristol. The 4 defendants, Sage Willoughby, Jake Skews, Milo Ponsford and Rhiann Graham, were found not guilty this week by a jury at Bristol Crown Court, where they were tried for pulling down a statue to the 18th century Bristol trader and slaver, Edward Colston. This verdict was condemned by several Conservative MPs. Robert Jennick felt that the rule of law had been undermined, and Tom Hunt of the Westminster Parliament's Common Sense Group was deeply concerned. Suella Braverman, the Tory Attorney General, said on Twitter, "Trial by jury is an important guardian of liberty and must not be undermined. However, the decision in the Colston statue case is causing confusion. If the case goes to the Court of Appeal, judges will not be able to overturn the jury's verdict, but could discuss whether there was an error in law in the conduct of the trial." MPs have complained that the not guilty verdict may create a precedent. However, juries' verdicts are not able to do that. There are previous cases where juries have agreed that the defendants were justified in taking direct action, such as destroying GM crops or growing cannabis for medical use. The Attorney General is considering whether to defer the matter to appeal in order to clarify the law for future occasions. The Hunterston B nuclear power station shut down forever at noon today after 46 years in service because it could no longer operate safely. The North Ayrshire plant provided 1 gigawatt of the UK's 7.9 gigawatt nuclear capacity, enough to power 1.7 million homes. However, in Scotland, the move in recent years has been has been towards renewable energy, with Scotland now producing 32 gigawatts. That's 23.8% of the UK's total renewable energy production in 2020, despite accounting for only 8% of the UK population. Hunterston B had lasted 20 years beyond its initial planned shutdown date. However, an increasing number of cracks in the graphite blocks which make up the reactor core meant it was no longer able to operate safely. The Scottish Government, sorry, did I get the number right there? The total was 32,000 gigawatts was the Scotland's renewable production, which comes to 23.8 of the UK's renewable total. Okay, so what happens meanwhile in the Scottish Government is opposed to the development of new nuclear in Scotland, preferring instead to see investment in wind, tidal, carbon capture and storage, and hydrogen to meet Scotland's future green energy needs. 300 staff will continue to be employed by EDF at the site during defuelling and decommissioning. Statistics show Scotland's supply of affordable housing has been 45% higher compared to England and Wales since 2007. Figures from the Scottish Government show that over a period from 2007-8 to 2019-20, the Scottish Government's supply of affordable housing per 10k of the population has been 45% higher compared to England and Wales. Since 2007, Scotland's Affordable Housing Supply Programme, that's the AHSB, 102,055 homes have been completed, and the Scottish Government indicated this year that it intends to make a capital investment of £3.3 billion via AHSP from 21 until 2026. In that time, the Scottish Government have delivered 96,750 affordable homes, nearly 67,000 of which were for social rent. £831 million was allocated for affordable housing in the Scottish Government's draft budget for 22 to 23. Commenting, SNP's MSP Stewart said, "Everyone should have a safe, warm, affordable home, and I am delighted to see the statistics which show that the Scottish SNP government is taking the action needed to make that a reality. It is crucial that the homes we create are also energy efficient and zero carbon. Not only is it vital for our climate responsibilities, but it will help to ensure energy costs in the future are affordable." The Scottish Government's recent investment of at least £1.8 billion heat and building strategy will help us to deliver this. Since 2007, Scotland has been leading the way in the creation of affordable homes, and I'm glad that the SNP government are continuing to rise to the challenge they have set themselves of delivering a further 100,000 affordable homes by 2032. And lastly, Sidney Poitier, whose groundbreaking acting work in the 1950s and 60s paved the way for generations of black film stars, has died aged 94. His death was announced on Friday by the Minister of Foreign Affairs for the Bahamas, Fred Mitchell. Poitier was born in Miami but raised in the Bahamas, and was the first black actor of the Best Actor to win the Best Actor Oscar for Lilies in the Field, and along with Halle Belafonte was a pioneering black presence in mainstream Hollywood cinema. Poitier secured his first significant film role in the 1950 film noir No Way Out. He played a hospital doctor whose racist patient, played by Richard Widmark, starts a race riot. With its overt depiction of racial conflict, No Way Out was considered too controversial to be shown in southern states, but established Poitier's trademark persona as a sensitive, forbearing figure, more intelligent than the whites who surrounded him. Poitier reached his high watermark as an actor in 1967 with three hit films: To Sir With Love, a British-produced answer to Blackboard Jungle, featuring Judy Geeson and Lulu in its cast. In the Heat of the Night, directed by Norman Jewison, starred Poitier as a shades-wearing detective Virgil Tibbs, investigating a murder in a racist Mississippi town. And Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, in which he tackled the thorny subject of interracial romance. So, Brian, those are the stories we're going to comment on now in a bit more detail. And then we have something to sum up with at the end. So let's look first of all at the continuing story of the unrest in Kazakhstan, or rather the reaction to it by the Kazakh security forces. So the reason we're featuring a story today is the president has given the order to open fire without warning. Is this a regime that's strong and in charge of things, or a regime that's teetering and in big trouble?
I think it would be the latter rather than the former, Hugh. I was looking into Kazakhstan today in preparation for tonight's show, and that was illuminating because it's a country that I didn't really know very much about, and I think one of the reasons for that is it's practically still a communist country with a very bad reputation still for human rights. So I think maybe that's why there's not a lot of news comes out of Kazakhstan. It was also interesting to maybe kind of look into what caused this unrest. And in the first place, articles in the mainstream media will tell you that it's because there was almost a doubling in fuel prices in a couple of days, which has led to unrest. And this is in a country which at the moment is in mostly sub-zero temperatures. But if you go back in time, then you begin to realise that, for example, in the 1980s, there was a huge mass demonstration against nuclear power, which is unpopular in Kazakhstan, and that was put down by the Russian military, and that caused even more discontent in the country. So the fact that we've now got a Russian peacekeeping force there in the country, Russia's incredibly unpopular in Kazakhstan. They are pretty much seen as Kazakhstan again shares a huge border with both China and Russia, so it's quite a delicate situation. And the president, who you mentioned, Tokayev, who gave the order to shoot to kill, he's more or less seen. He's been a hand-picked successor to the previous president, Nazarbayev, who was in power for over 30 years. And Nazarbayev he's still pulling a lot of the strings behind the scenes. He's still got a lot of sway. So it's a country where there's a small elite who have amassed a lot of money, and meanwhile the people that are having to work really hard, they've still got really tough existences. So I think it's only a matter of time before things boil over.
Yeah, it's also surrounded by other countries which are in a similar situation. I mean, places like Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Russia. And what I mean is they're all countries which have authoritarian so-called communist governments. And so it's really about the power of the state and them saying, we've got the army, we've got security forces, and we don't mind shooting.
It's about the power of the state, but it's also a lot of people inside Kazakhstan are calling for international intervention, namely mostly probably from the US. Kazakhstan is a member of NATO, but some people are calling for America to get involved. But a lot of people are cautious or wary of that because Kazakhstan, it's got a lot of oil. That's its main industry at the moment, I think. But it's also got a huge wealth of minerals at the moment. And the current troubles, if America does go in, it'll be the perfect excuse for them to then...
You mean if Russia goes in?
Well, either or both. Russia's in there at the moment as a peacekeeping force, and there's a lot of people saying to counter that there should be an American or a NATO peacekeeping force. But that's probably just the foot in the door for the West to go in there and exploit their mineral wealth, perhaps.
Yes, no, I didn't realise there was any possibility. Well, very remote possibility, I hope, of NATO getting involved, getting boots on the ground, as they say. I haven't read anyone talking about that.
It's something that people are talking about. Yeah. I mean, there's a chap who lives in France. His name is Mukhtar Ablaz. Forgive me, Mukhtar Ablazou, I think. He's a right-wing banker who's living in France.
And a right-wing what?
A right-wing banker.
Okay.
Living in France, and he's accused of fraud and murder, and he's calling for an American intervention, and it looks like he would like to foster the West's interests, as in those mineral rights. So he's quite shady, and living in France, but possibly wanting to come in and take over in the end if there's a possibility. It's hugely complex, but basically it's a situation where it's a powder keg, I suppose.
And as you say, it is oil rich. In fact, it's the biggest economy in that area out of all of those states. I think the whole of that area, Kazakhstan represents about 60% of the economy.
Yeah.
So you can see why Russia wants to, what shall we say, extend solidarity to the president.
Yeah, I think the minerals have yet to be exploited. I think it's oil and agriculture. It was a huge grain growing area for Russia, provided a lot of grain from the steppes for Russia when it was part of the Soviet Union's empire.
Yep.
Which fell in the 1990s with Gorbachev and.
It's probably 1991. I think that's when. When did Kazakhstan actually declare independence? I think it's been an independent country from 1991. So since then, of course, a lot of countries became independent of the old Soviet Union. Then the Soviet Union collapsed a few weeks actually after Kazakhstan was created. But they haven't moved towards democracy. All of those countries we mentioned have authoritarian governments, and they're planning on staying there.
Yeah, I'm not sure that the current leader even got in by election. I think he was handpicked.
Yes, by the previous president. He's also called Nur Sultan, which also happens to be the name of the new capital of that country. In case you were wondering what happened to Astana, it's still the massive capital that they built. Astana is now called Nur Sultan after the previous president. Yep, be wary of countries who name their capitals after the president. Yes. When he's still alive. Okay, well, let's move on to the next story we discussed earlier on tonight. Well, I said it, we haven't discussed it yet. Boris Johnson's latest corruption scandal. Now, what do you make of this? We're talking about the famous dispute over who paid for the wallpaper for Downing Street flat. And the story that's come out this week is that the guy who paid it wants to run a festival in Britain. What part of that do you want to look at first? Do you want to look at the wallpaper or the festival of Brexit?
I'll go for the first option, the wallpaper.
Let's take the wallpaper then. Lulu's wallpaper. A different Lulu to the one that Sidney Poitier played with.
Yeah, the top-end designer. Yeah. What can I say? Our Prime Minister lies, and that's a fact. And I was most struck recently by an interview that Boris Johnson, he was interviewed by, I think it was Sky News, I can't remember the name of the journalist, it wasn't Beth Rigby, but so she was asking about whether Johnson had broken the ministerial code by taking this money to pay for that wallpaper. And Johnson just continually kept answering the questions with the same reply, which was, I did not break the ministerial code. I did not break the ministerial code. I did not break the ministerial code. But the thing that was most telling, I thought, was Johnson's expression. He had this smirk on his face, which just more or less said, you can't get me, you can't touch me, I am immune. It's like whether I did this or not, whether it was right or wrong or not, it's not going to come to any trouble for me. It was incredible.
It's about once again. It's really about Downing Street investigating itself, because the whole imbroglio was given to Lord Gate to investigate, and Gate cleared Johnson. But the story this week, of course, is that there's now been the papers have got hold of I think it was text exchanges, or was it WhatsApp exchanges between Johnson and I've forgotten his name, the fellow who wants the festival.
Brownlow, Lord Brownlow.
Yeah, Brownlow. And Gate is saying, you know, it's a pity you hadn't showed me those texts when I was investigating you, because if I'd seen that, I might have come to a different decision. But again, he said, but never mind, it's all water under the bridge now. We're not going to go over it again.
Yeah, again, I think it's telling that all the people that are involved in this, they're all lords. So apart from Johnson himself. What else can we say about that? I mean, it's well, maybe moving on to the Great Exhibition too. I'm not sure. I think this is a take on the first Great Exhibition, which was in 1851 in the Crystal Palace in London, and it's telling that the aim of that exhibition was to promote or even to cement Britain's prowess as a world-leading nation and industrial revolution, and how great Britain was at everything in empire and imperialism and all of those things, and it does pretty much symbolise all of those things for the Victorian age. It's like it's pretty much the first thing that school children would probably think of if they were to say, what do you think of, what's the first thing that comes into your mind if you talk about the Victorians? And so I think that the idea is that there will be a second great exhibition to promote the fact, or well, it's not a fact, to promote the notion that Brexit has been a success and that Brexit is now independent, and that Britain is now an independent nation once again and has secured its borders and has taken back control. So I think that's the underlying message of these WhatsApp messages in GE2. Everybody's saying, what is GE2, what is GE2? I think it's going to be the second great exhibition to follow on from the one that was championed by Queen Victoria.
The language. I don't know if you tire, like I do, of seeing things labelled with 2.0 or 3.0 or something. That's to make it sound trendy and internety. But as you said, it's actually a return to the Victorian days because people don't do national exhibitions anymore.
Yeah, it's going to be vainglorious and bombastic and nationalistic and probably unbearable for most of the people that are up here in this side of the border.
I wonder if it's Johnson's version of the Millennium Dome. Remember back in the Blair government, as they were approaching the year 2000, they had this idea of we've got to build a big thing somewhere, and they can never decide what big thing to build. So eventually they made a big tent in London, and now I haven't been there, but I think it's still a big venue. So it seems to me they've first of all, this idea was Theresa May's Festival of Brexit. And that didn't really catch on too well. But it's the same sort of thing that after departure from Europe, we've got to do a big something, but they don't really know what it is.
It's in that vein, and there's also a handy hook to hang it on, which is this year is going to be Queen Elizabeth's Jubilee year. So there's bound to be a lot of celebrations.
Platinum Jubilee, yes.
Oh, yeah, Platinum Jubilee, yeah, you're right. So they're going to be looking for something to do with that as well. There's going to be a lot around that. And so a great exhibition to mark that at the same time. It's a happy confluence for the Westminster government, I would think.
Okay, so we'll see how that works. So obviously it's got an internal and an external focus. These things traditionally were, of course, to show the world our latest steam train or our great achievements, or the SS Great Britain or something like that.
I do wonder what would the Great Exhibition Mark II contain if it is going to highlight Britain's greatness post-Brexit. I can't really see anything that would go in there that would make any sense.
Yeah, it'll be fascinating to see what they want to put into it. But of course, it's also got the internal intention, of course, of securing the family of nations. It's obviously got to say we're better together because we've made this wonderful something. Yes, I know I'm struggling to remember what are the great British achievements of the last few years. Well, that's the latest then on the latest corruption scandal involving Number 10, one of several that we've commented on over the last year, Brian. So the next story I read out a while ago is half an hour ago was the latest in the Colston statue case. We, of course, discussed in the news, I think that was Wednesday, that the 4 individuals who were accused and, in fact, who did tear down the statue to Edward Colston and chuck it in the harbour in Bristol. They didn't deny doing that, but what happened is that the jury found them not guilty because the jury agreed that they had a good justification for doing that. So that was the news on Wednesday, but we're discussing it tonight because the Attorney General, Suella Braverman, according to her own words, she's thinking about maybe putting that verdict to the appeal court. So she's not, according to what I read today, she's not made her mind up that there was anything wrong with the verdict. And in fact, she did say juries are in charge. So if the jury decided, then that's it. It's not up to the government or anybody else to tell the jury that they got it wrong. So she is saying, yes, juries, in a jury trial, the jury decides the law. That's it. However, several Conservative MPs are really not happy about it. So what is it they're not happy about? Are they saying this was the wrong jury? How do you see this?
I think they're unhappy about the fact that these 4 people did commit what would normally be seen as vandalism, or if it's a statue, then maybe even acts of iconoclasm. And that caused damage, apparently, to the pavement, a couple of £1,000s worth of damage to the pavement. And then the statue was thrown in the harbour, as you say. So I think the Conservative MPs are worried that this is going to give licence to people that might want to protest, and they will not be charged or found guilty in court. So it doesn't really appeal to right-wing Conservative MPs' sentiments about law-abiding citizens and what they consider to be right and wrong. I think it's also interesting maybe to note that one of the MPs that has said that the jury's verdict should stand is Jacob Rees-Mogg, and I don't really trust Mr. Rees-Mogg, so that makes me wonder, does he have some reason for not wanting to overturn the jury? Does he have a case coming up somewhere where he thinks he's going to get a not guilty verdict, and he doesn't want that to be overturned by the government? But the current Conservative government in Westminster, they have form on changing laws retrospectively that they don't like. They did that to the Scottish government here in Holyrood, who recently wanted to incorporate the United Nations
the rights of the child
into Scottish law, and that was passed by the Scottish government, I think unanimously, and by all across Holyrood, by all parties that agreed to it. But Westminster didn't like that, took that to court, and it came in their favour, and then they changed the law retrospectively to stop the Scottish government being able to do that. So they won't have any qualms, I don't think, about taking this back to court to see if they can get it. If not overruled, then certainly some kind of alternative ruling.
Well, what they might do is insert this kind of civil, what would you call this? A protest, direct action. It's possible that they could reposition that and put it into the policing crimes bill that's been going through Parliament. So one thing I read today is that even if they had been found guilty, the Bristol Four would have been subject to only light sentences. I think, a minor fine or maybe 30 days or something like that. Don't quote me on that. But if this was changed in future, it could be up to 10 years. So one thing they might do for future cases to say if you damage equipment, as you said, Conservative MPs are very concerned about damage to property because they own a lot of it. So they're saying in future events like this, if you cause a scratch on something, you could be up to 10 years in jail. So I don't think they're seeking, well, at least according to Suella Braverman, the Attorney General, they're not seeking to overturn. That would be a major change if you actually said, right, we're going to sack that jury and we're going to decide on the verdict. So they're not, as far as I know, they're not going that far and saying we're going to overturn the jury.
Yeah, it's interesting to go back to the actual trial. And if you think about it, the fact that these people, they did, I mean, there's video footage that shows them tearing down the statue and rolling it towards the harbour and tossing it in the water. So there's no doubt that this act happened and they were the people who did it. But so then you might think, well, if that is against the law, then why were they found not guilty? And it would seem to be that the court case centred around the fact that the very existence of that statue of Colston was a greater crime and a greater offence to the people of Bristol than who was a slave trader, and that his slavery and his commemoration in that bronze statue in the city centre, which people would have to walk past every day, that was more offensive to people than the act of tearing the statue down and tossing it in the harbour. So that's quite an interesting. It's almost like two wrongs don't make a right, but slavery is a much greater breach of.
Well, yeah, that's what was argued. The defendants themselves actually did say, well, at least one of them who was on local news in Bristol said, I'm not actually advocating that people to break things. I'm not actually advertising criminal damage. But this particular one, the thing we did was really minor compared to the effrontery of looking at this trader every day, this guy who was a slave trader. And this is a fact. He was a Conservative businessman. He first of all dealt with ordinary goods, and then he decided to start dealing in slaves. And it is thought, I read in the Guardian today, that he probably was responsible for 19,000 deaths. His ships traded something like 85,000 slaves out of Bristol, and it's thought that something like 19,000 of them died.
Yeah.
So that's what the defendant said, right? I just chucked a statue in the harbour.
Exactly.
It's not the same as killing 19,000 people.
It's mass murder, basically, and it's an appalling state of affairs to have happened. And we could say, well, it happened 200 years ago, and we shouldn't judge them by our sensibilities here in the 21st century. But the fact is, Bristol is trying to rehabilitate itself from its reputation and its connections and its links to slavery. There were a lot of, Colston was a philanthropist. He gave a lot of money to found schools in the city, and they were all named after him. But before the Black Lives Matter movement and the statue being torn down, those schools that were named after him have now all been renamed. I think they're called the Montpellier schools now in Bristol. And so this it's part of a trend in Bristol which is trying to distance itself from its connections to the slave trade. So again, it kind of makes sense about the verdict that was reached.
Yeah, the other aspect, just before we move on to our next story, the other interesting aspect is really to refer to previous cases of this kind. I mean, where the defendants have said, yes, we did it, but it was the right thing to do. I was reminded, for instance, of one that happened here in the west of Scotland a few years ago. Do you remember the Swords for Ploughshares team who... 3 females boarded a barge called the Mayfair, which was stationed in Loch Goil, and over a Sunday morning, I think they gradually dismantled all the machinery they could find and chucked it in the loch, causing tens of thousands of pounds worth of damage. And they did this as a protest, and in fact, it was quite bizarre. Really, you couldn't do this today. I don't recommend you try it, but nobody stopped them. In fact, I think they had to phone the cops themselves because they wanted to make a case and they wanted to go to court.
It wasn't going the way they wanted. Yeah, and you'll see a lot of people on social media saying, does this mean now that I can go down to Westminster and pull down Winston Churchill's statue if I don't like Winston Churchill? But the fact is, I mean, you could do that and then see if you get away with it in the court. Or if there was a statue of Florence Nightingale or somebody like that, if I don't like statues of women, then can I tear that down? But the fact is, then you'd have to go to court and explain why you thought Florence Nightingale was on par with Colston and his 19,000 dead slaves that were trading. So I would say good luck with that one.
Well, I think, yeah, you made the key point there that if somebody does contemplate civil action of this kind, they need to have a solid justification, and they need to be able to explain that to the jury. Or in the case of the 3 in Loch Goil, again, I should have said they were found not guilty. I think that was by the sheriff. I don't think that went to a jury. But again, they made the argument that these things that we've been chucking overboard are weapons of mass destruction, and they made a legal case that Britain had already signed United Nations declarations against weapons of mass destruction. So what they were actually doing was helping to stop a crime and not to cause a crime. So it's an interesting legal debate there, but the sheriff went for it.
Yeah. And just one last quick point on the Colston case. For me, one of the really good outcomes about this incident is that the statue was fished out of the river and was taken in by a museum in Bristol. Some work was done on it, so any damage that had happened to it would have been stabilised, and it's now on display in a museum with quite an extensive display explaining who Colston was, what he did, and the Black Lives Matter movement, and that I think is the right place for it, instead of being out on the street without any context and just offending people that are against racism and slavery.
Yeah, we did discuss the other night, actually, on Wednesday, the whole idea of revisiting statues and looking at all our cities and saying, who exactly is that up there in that plinth? Who put them there, and why were they admired at that time? And if later on we change our opinion on these people, it's not cancelling culture, it's not cancelling to history to say, let's put that one in the museum and put another one on the plinth instead.
And why are they all of white men of a certain age? So it's a fairly easy question to answer, I think.
Okay, so there we are. So perhaps the Attorney General will refer the Colston 4 case to the Court of Appeal. Again, not really with the view of overturning that case, but to maybe establish tighter guidelines in future for direct action of that kind. So she's not decided, but she may do that. She's thinking of that, obviously. Okay, Brian, the next story we discussed is a story from right here in Scotland today, about lunchtime. the power station, the nuclear power station down the Ayrshire coast, was turned off eventually. So that was the Torness B power station, the original one, the Torness A. Sorry, not Torness. Sorry, the other one. What do you call it? Hunterston B. The Hunterston A was already turned off a while ago. So the Hunterston B kept on going for something like 20 years over its sell-by date. But people have been reporting for many years about cracks in the graphite core, and there were many of those, with dozens of cracks apparently. So EDF, who were operating it, just couldn't keep it running safely. What do you think about this? Is this a start, or is this confirming Scotland's move towards a renewable future?
A nuclear-free future? I hope so. I think there's going to be a lot of people in the Green Party in Holyrood that are going to be very pleased about this announcement. And I don't think it should cause too much trouble for the SNP and the current agreement they've got with the Green Party. I think I'm right in saying, but I'm happy to stand corrected. I think the SNP, since something like 2016, said that they would not replace Hunterston B. There would be no Hunterston C. And as far as I know, they still hold that position. I think it's interesting to know, you mentioned that the power station is owned by EDF. You might not realise from those three initials that EDF is wholly owned by the French state. So any profits that came out that were generated from Hunterston B went straight into the French taxpayers' pockets. I think that's maybe another good reason why perhaps that should come to an end. And yes, and you mentioned cracks as well, but that's the latest in quite a long line of safety issues that the station had. I've got a wee list here. In 1977, seawater entered the reactor via a modification of the cooling system. That seawater evaporated, which left quite a lot of the workings coated with a layer of salt. So as a result of that, the reactor had to close for a year.
Or was that the older reactor, the Hunterston
Could have been.
reactor?
Could have been. I'm not sure. Yeah. And that cost £14 million to rectify, and it obviously wasn't producing any energy for the year that it was shut down. Then in 1997, there were fears that radioactive, this is unbelievable, this one, there were fears that radioactive carbon dioxide from the plant had entered the food chain via fizzy drinks. This is true. Carlsberg found that one of their cylinders of CO2 that they had sourced was contaminated. And so they got rid of that.
It reached the parts other beers couldn't reach, did it?
Absolutely. So that was quite something. I didn't know about that one. 1998 saw a level 2 incident, so that's really quite high up. There was a storm that Christmas, which brought down power lines to the station. So if you imagine you've got a power station which needs electricity to run, and that power supply was cut when those lines came down in that storm. So there was no power to cool the reactors, and the temperature started to go up. There were emergency diesel generators that kicked in, but they quite soon began to fail. And then people realised that quite a lot of the steps that they would have to have taken to deal with the failing reactor could only be done by computer. It was all controlled by computers, but they couldn't operate the computers because there was no electricity.
Aye.
So that was quite a close-run thing. And then and as you say, then in 2006, the cracks were first found in the graphite crack cores. It's telling again that it was only meant to run until 2011, and here we are in 2022.
So it's finally gone. Now let's just underline the Scottish Government's own position is all pro renewable. In fact, as we read out earlier on, Scotland is making really a huge amount of renewable electricity now, almost 100% of Scotland's needs, and as we read out earlier, about 24% of the whole of the UK needs from renewables. So that's definitely the way the Scottish Government is going, and in fact they haven't given any permission for nuclear in Scotland, although it is actually a reserved matter. The UK would probably love to see a new Hunterston C built, but at the moment I think the Scottish Government would probably say will not give planning permission for the construction, although technically it's still reserved to Westminster.
Yeah, the SNP I'm pretty sure have barred any
Yeah.
new nuclear developments, and I think Rolls-Royce have got plans to construct more smaller nuclear power stations around Britain, but and they're obviously keen that some of them should be built in Scotland. But I think you'll find that the Scottish Government and Holyrood will do its very best to prevent that happening. And I think maybe just as COP26 has only just finished, I had a wee look at that, and COP26 is actually for nuclear energy. They see nuclear energy as a useful step towards decarbonisation, which does make sense. You know, there is no, you know, it's not like burning oil or coal, but obviously there are other perhaps potential greater risks with nuclear energy, especially if it's leaking into the seas around Scotland and potential meltdowns. But yeah, so COP26 is for nuclear energy, but I think you'll find that the Scottish Government will go beyond that and say, no, let's just rely on solar, hydro.
Yeah, now that's interesting. So the SNP, if you look around Europe anyway, so the SNP is definitely saying no new nuclear, although as you said, the British government would love to push it, and of course, but the SNP actually has never been pro-nuclear. We find that around Europe, France is just about entirely nuclear, but Germany, on the other hand, with the Greens and the coalition government, is very much against it.
It goes hand in hand with Trident, I'm sure, that the SNP stand about nuclear power and nuclear submarines and nuclear missiles on Scottish soil.
Yep, but there's always a strong overlap between so-called peaceful use of nuclear power and the military. The military is never far away. But as you said, actually, it's also very expensive to run and to repair Hunterston over the years. And you mentioned earlier on that any profits go to EDF in France. Now, the only reason they're making profits is because we're subsidising it, because nuclear power is incredibly expensive. Really, they shouldn't be making any profits at all. It actually shows a huge loss. So the only reason it was still there is because taxpayers were paying for it, propping up. So I suppose what you're saying really is that the UK taxpayers' money was being sent to EDF in France. Because we shouldn't forget that compared to renewables, actually, nuclear power is hugely expensive.
Yes.
And these new mini plants, you know, they're also going to be very expensive. And we really go against. But the whole idea of sustainability in the UN definition, of course, is that you don't leave your mess for other generations to clear up. And so this is going to be left for how many generations would it take to get rid of the half-life of the nuclear contamination? Too many
generations.
So I know people argue, in a sense, it's green because it doesn't mean mining anything that's going to run out. I don't know if they're going to run out of uranium. But the other aspect, of course, is this business of, you mentioned, using it now. The COP26 saying, well, maybe it's a bit dirty, maybe it's a bit dangerous, maybe it's a bit expensive, but we'll use it as a bridge, I think is the phrase. A lot of people have been using this idea, all right, we're not going to use it permanently, but it's a bridge, so can we use it now? But that might be a very long bridge.
Yeah, there will be some countries that will find it that they'll maybe reach their zero carbon targets if they rely on nuclear. But if we can do it without having to rely on nuclear, then I'd say that's only a good thing.
Yeah, but I've used the bridge as an example because that same argument of let's just do this now and we'll just do it one more, just give us one more oil field, because the oil industry has used the same argument for the Campbell field, which I think the UK government's now decided they're not going to go ahead with. But before COP, you know, back in August, September, the oil industry was saying we need to use Campbell as a bridge towards low carbon, and people were scratching their heads saying, how does that work? How does making more oil move towards going away from oil?
I think the theory was that we wouldn't have to import it from other countries, and that would have a smaller green footprint or something ridiculous like that. I think maybe just before we run out of time, it's maybe just also worth saying that although Hunterston is no longer producing any power as of today, it's going to be quite a while before the last person who leaves the building turns the lights out. There's going to be a lot of people still employed there to decommission the station and to deal with all the nuclear contaminants safely, hopefully.
Yes, I don't know where the actual material goes, but the spent fuel goes to Sellafield down in Cumbria. So, yeah, that's right. There's going to be a lot of people employed for, well, create jobs for hundreds of years. So, Let's look at it on the bright side. So anyway, Scotland is now definitely, well, moving away from nuclear. There is, as I was confused myself earlier on, still the Torness plant. But again, the Scottish Government is not keen on any new nuclear. But don't forget, it is actually a reserved matter. But so far, Westminster hasn't forced any new nuclear on Scotland.
Yeah.
That would cause
Torness can't be far behind
yes, I
Hunterston
think
in
so.
terms of age.
It is due for decommissioning. I forget
Yeah.
when, something like 26.
They're all about the same generation.
Yeah. Yes, it's the old style nuclear. Okay, so, but don't forget, as we also said earlier on, Scotland has a huge amount of renewable potential, and in fact, we've really only just begun tapping the potential that does lie there. We haven't really got into wind, we got into wind, but we haven't really got into wave and tide, so there's still a lot of energy to be tapped from there.
And it's also just
Okay,
if there's time, it's also worth mentioning that a lot of people leave out solar when it comes to Scottish renewables, but it should definitely be in there, because I think there's a misconception that I think a lot of people think that solar panels rely on sunshine, and Scotland isn't famed for its long sunny summers and or even sunny winters, but that's not true. Solar panels gather energy simply from light. It doesn't have to be a cloudless day with a sunny sky. If it's cloudy or kind of overcast, solar panels will still generate electricity. Maybe not as much as they would on a sunny day, but they'll still work. And so there's no reason why we shouldn't have solar in the mix as well.
Okay, and just before we move on, I forgot, I did look up the Scottish Green Party's position, and they emphasised, of course, on Hunterston the idea of the just transfer away from old jobs towards new jobs. And they also pointed out that the huge costs of running nuclear could have a better alternative. If you're spending 10 million or 100 million in this, just think how much that could do if it was developing wind or increasing solar or tidal. There's been tiny amounts spent on research compared to the huge amount that's been thrown into nuclear over the years. So that's the Greens' point, yeah. It's very expensive to run nuclear. We could spend that money on something else which is better.
Yes.
And it doesn't produce.
Yeah, and there's also hydro as well. We haven't mentioned hydro.
Hydro is also very important for storage, of course. Obviously, a few years ago, people supporting nuclear would say, well, nuclear is always there, 24/7. It never runs out. It's what they call the baseline. You never dip below that. However, obviously, the other stuff is intermittent. But one of the great things with hydro is, of course, you can store energy at the top.
Yes.
If only you had lochs and rainfall and mountains, you could store energy up a hill, right? Well, I think we'll move on now to our the final story we read out tonight was the sad news today that Sidney Poitier had died at the age of 94. This takes us back to the period when really black musicians or black entertainers were ghettoized into a small part of the Hollywood. They would really be only used as jazz musicians. Maybe they didn't really get acting parts. So Poitier and his contemporary Halle Belafonte were really the first black actors to make that breakthrough. Was Poitier an important figure in American culture?
I think he was. Not only an important figure in black American culture, but I've also got a theory that a lot of people's mums, like mine, kind of secretly fancied Sidney Poitier. If there was either an Alan Ladd movie on or a Sidney Poitier movie on, then my mum would make sure that she was sat watching that. She'd go, "Ooh, a Sidney Poitier movie." So that's kind of like when he started to come into my consciousness as a lad, watching films on the telly. But certainly, the fact that he was the first black actor to be nominated for awards like Oscars and Oscar-winning actor, but also BAFTAs as well. And a lot of the movies, as you outlined in the report, tackled race relations. Especially those three in 1967, To Sir With Love, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, and In the Heat of the Night. What I didn't realise was that he was also a director. He directed Stir Crazy, which I didn't know, and also the American Film Institute, the American equivalent of our British Film Institute, they've got a rank of the 100 most important movie actors American movie actors, and Sidney Poitier came in at 22nd on that list. So he's definitely an important actor. And I was just looking at a small clip of an interview where he was giving what looked like a press conference, actually, but probably being interviewed when one of his movies was out. And he took umbrage at the quality of the questions that were being given to him by the journalists who were there. And he was basically saying, why do you only ask me about race riots and race issues and my colour? He said, there's a lot more to me than this. I'm an American. I'm a man. I'm an actor. There's, why is this all I get when I get interviewed by the press? And I think he was right to be angry at that. And I think it was maybe those kinds of displays that made him an important figure.
Mm-hmm. No, I didn't know he had produced as well. It certainly reminds me that maybe I should look up some of his films that I've not seen. I don't know if they're available, but certainly I do remember watching In the Heat of the Night, and that's a stunning film, really. It's very, not only for his performance, but Rod Steiger as well.
Yeah, it stands up really well. It's like, it could be, a current modern day movie, I think, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep. It's interesting to me, though, how the voice of American black and white actors has changed over the years. I guess he was very well spoken, wasn't he? He was very polite and urbane and refined. But that's not what you do. If a director nowadays is looking for a streetwise black character, they're not going to talk like that, are they?
No, maybe not. And I think also maybe it's that name Poitier. It sounds it's quite it's
exotic.
Posh, yeah, exotic. It's a French name, and I think you mentioned that. Sidney Poitier, he was the son of a farmer, so he came from sort of working class stock. His family had connections to the Bahamas, which I think is why, although he was born in Miami, why he went to the Bahamas to be brought up. And one of his uncles, I think, did some digging about the family name Poitier, about why it's a French name which you would associate maybe with white French people, and so how did they come to be living in America, black family with a French name. They couldn't find any slave owners basically in the Bahamas with the name Poitier, but apparently there was a white plantation owner called Poitier on Jamaica who owned slaves, and all of those slaves took the name Poitier, which I think was the common, that was the norm in those days. So that's probably perhaps where Sydney's ancestors came from.
Of course, for similar reasons, there's a lot of Scottish names, of course, in the Caribbean too.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily something to be proud of. Okay, so thank you, Sidney Poitier, for those tremendous movies. I'll look at the ones I haven't seen yet. Well, we better just about wind up. Oh, before we go, Brian, I was intrigued to hear today that a Tory MP has called for the BBC to sign off every day with the national anthem. I wonder, we'll come to that in a minute, but let's just, as I leave that hanging there, let me remind our viewers, regular viewers, first of all, let me thank you for being our regular viewers, and especially to you if you're subscribing and keeping Broadcasting Scotland going. We do have a big crowdfunder that you look at on our website. We do intend to raise £500,000, and we're over 35,000 towards that. £5,000 at least, I'm told. Now, for that budget anyway, we can be broadcasting 7 days a week and putting out more programmes. We're hoping to broadcast from lunchtime onwards, and including the Scottish Parliament and other programmes. So that's what the fundraiser is for. If you can give anything else, that's great. That would help us to expand the range of programmes into this year. Now, I don't know if we are going to follow Andrew Rosendale's advice, however, and conclude the programmes with the national anthem. How do you think that's going to go down? As the BBC said, oh yes, oh boy, great idea.
Tug forelock, doff cap,
Yep.
Kind of thing. I think, have we got time to mention about how Newsnight finised off their programme?
Just very quickly.
Last night, Newsnight more or less paid homage to that. Their show with Kirsty Wark played out with God Save the Queen, but not the traditional version, but with the Sex Pistols version. So that was quite good.
Yeah, what a cheeky way to go. Well, we're not going to do anything like that. So from Brian and me, Let's finish tonight's programme with the national anthem, and it's Scotland, full Scotland.
Scots wha hae wi Wallace bled, Scots whom Bruce has often led, welcome to your gory bed, or to victory. Now's the day and now's the hour, see the front, old battle hour, see approach proud Edward's power, chains and slavery. War would be a traitor knave, war would fill a coward's grave, war say base as be a slave, let him turn and flee. War's for Scotland's king and law, freeman's sword will strongly draw, free man stand or free man fall, let him follow me. By oppression's woes and pains, by your sons in servile chains, we will drain our dearest veins, but we shall be free. Lay the proud usurpers low, tyrants fall in every foe, liberties in every blow, let us day or day. Scots wha hae wi Wallace bled, Scots whom Bruce has oft times led, welcome to your gory bed, or to victory.